secular world over in France. And of course, they had tried earlier to get into masonry at the end of the 17th, beginning of the 18th century. There, Elias Ashmole in the British Museums had a son-in-law who was on the stock exchange in the 1680s. And it's unpublished. My friend Ron Heisler found it in the British Museum, and he writes quite astonishingly, who are these dervishes that are on the stock exchange? I mean, dervishes are usually like Chinese nuns. It's very unusual to find them making huge political contributions. But these dervishes were over there playing the stock exchange, and we then find a reference in Masonic Catechism, only recently published, but to our brethren in Constantinople, our Turkish brethren in Constantinople, who pray with their faces towards Jerusalem. In other words, they were Sabellians. By this time, 1720, they were Dharma. There's no further documentation on the relationship of the Dharma with English Freemasonry. There is a most remarkable book written in 1925 on Turkish Freemasonry, which has just been translated into English, small firm in Texas. Definitely worth reading. The author is one Rudolf von Sebettendorf. Rudolf von Sebettendorf is known from certain books on Adolf Hitler, mostly grossly inaccurate. But Sebettendorf talks about these Turkish Freemasons. Sebettendorf, as a young man, made it 1900, was down in Cairo. He met these very healthy, helpful dervishes, and they sent him up to their friends in Constantinople, and they knew these bankers in Salonika who put up a lot of money for Sebettendorf, who worked for the Turkish army during the first, as intelligence agent during the First World War, and when it was over, they gave him a big present. These were, of course, these Turkish Freemasons are, of course, the Dharma. And they gave him a substantial contribution to open a newspaper in Munich, which 2 years later was bought by a young political would-be named Adolf Hitler. Meanwhile, back in Turkey, the plot begins to get even thicker. In 1912, one Kemal Ataturk seizes control of the Turkish government with a movement abolishes the Caliphate, with a group known as the Young Turks. Mr. Ataturk was an Albanian by birth, and strangely enough, he was educated in Salonika at a school which had been a Dharma school since the 18th century. Ataturk always denied he was a Dharma. He could hardly have admitted it. But the fact is, what were Albanians shipping their children to Salonika to a Dharma school for? And certainly there were no less than 4 members of the Dharmas who became members of Ataturk's cabinet. Some put the number at 12. How do we know this? Because this time there's a public trial for treason in 1926. For once they really flunked an assignment, and their irate public put them on trial. And it further came out, these people were really going well. They had arranged the Armenian Holocaust of 1916, and in 1915 they were in Ireland, where they were selling guns to the IRA. Dharmas have long had an international weapon industry, with the financial backing to run, and they keep a very low profile. One of their contacts in London was an Egyptologist named Marcus Blackton, who was also a member of the Golden Dawn. Now, he was also one of A.E. Waite's best friends, and, quote, rewrote the Golden Dawn rituals when the Great Golden Dawn split occurred in 1901 to 3. Every official book tells you that the A.E. Waite took the GD and still unpublished rituals further into Christian mysticism. When he split with the Magic Working Group, it had been run by McGregor Mathers, and which retained the patronage of W.B. Yeats and J. Brodie Innes. Nothing could be further from the truth. Waite was a practicing Satanist. And Marcus Blackton had a particular Egyptological background, which he really liked playing around with the mummies over in the British Museum. I know this is straight out of a Hammer horror movie, but believe me, it can all be documented. There actually was a public scandal in 1901 when Annie Horniman, who was Yeats's patroness of the Abbey, went through the Egyptian room at the British Museum and went into a cold faint. when she got whammied by one of the idols in a back corner. It turned out it was being used as a meditation center by Mr. Blackton. In a small group, he was instructing his Egyptological theories. Well, we'll have to leave Mr. Blackton down and get back to W.B. Yeats. A.E. Waite, by the way, during this whole fight, stayed strictly out of the whole fight, in which Yeats tried to expel Blackton from the GD, and that he did resign from the group that was headed by Yeats's friend Florence Farr, otherwise known as SSDD. In fact, Yeats wrote a great poem about it. In fact, a vision is about Florence. Let's see what he said. I think it's worth, and do bear these things in mind, because they all tie in together here. Yeats never told the engraver, Edmond Dulac, or anyone else what he meant by this diagram. There was no specific exposition of the words that are written on there or the tarot symbols. Notice the four suits of the tarot, in a rather strange form, are set at the four corners of that wheel. And there were four words beginning with sapientia, which mark the four quarters. Those words never occur during the course of the book. And here's a friend of Jacob Crock who hasn't yet been mentioned in the story. But he's the last. We've met all the main characters of this afternoon, except this fellow. In fact, he may be the most important character of all, except W.B. Yeats. He does not get mentioned in any standard textbook on W.B. Yeats, but he was playing his part, shall we say. The god Set, otherwise known as the crucified ass. This graffiti was discovered in Rome in 1854. At some unspecified period that we do not know, but certainly by 1865 to 7, the cult of the god with the ass's head had been reformulated by the Cairo branch of the Dhamma. This may have been formulated earlier, but it certainly got a big push after the publishing of these archaeological things of the crucified ass. The theory was, and this has never been enunciated publicly, it's how Waite got by with it for so many years, that ancient Egyptian myth, this is an innocent enough myth in context, and it can be applied yearly, and etc., in which Set was seen as being the anarch forces, chaotic forces, but was not necessarily evil in older Egyptian myth. Nevertheless, Egypt is the one civilization that did have a myth of two messiahs, in which, shall we say, that Set could be seen as an absolutely necessary part of the cosmological process. However, he was not necessarily evil in Egypt. He was only equal at certain periods of history. The Hyksos had him, and he was very bad. However, remember the Promptus doctrine that was also held by the Dhamma, the idea that we were nearing the end of the age and it must be hastened so that the advent of the Lord of Evil could come the second time, the birth of the Antichrist. When the Cairo Dhamma got a hold of the crucified ass god, they really went to town with this thing. They carried it to America first. And there actually was a book, this is very important for our subject today, published in 1890. It never had but one review. The review was by a close friend of W.B. Yeats, John S. Mead, and it's called Geometry and Religion. And it opens with the diagram parallel to the diagram you have just seen. If you can see the faces of the moon again, could we have the faces of the moon back? It's been impossible to get a picture of the frontispiece for religion and geometry, or geometry and religion, because the only copy I can find is in the British Museum. And they demanded it be microfilmed, and there was no way a copy be made out, and there was simply no way to get a copy here. Again, they won't let it be Xeroxed in the ordinary manner. I cannot find another copy of it. I'm told by people who have looked that it's not listed, that they can't find it on the internet here in this country. It was written by a New Yorker. He goes over there, and it shows the circle of the moon, and the new moon in Sagittarius. What is more, there is an account of how you can attach the emblems of the four tarot suits to the phases of the moon. So he doesn't do anything with this idea. He just says you could do it. Well, this book never had any reviews. It's a very loaded book. It's very much concerned with masonry. And yes, if you read the small print, like the Waite small grid, it turns out that the god Set is bound to resurrect somewhere around the year 2000. And we're waiting for his coming again. The author of this book understandably preferred to remain anonymous. And as I say, there was only one review, but it was done by a close friend of W.B. Yeats. As this happens to be the only major book written in the West on geometry, if you want to call it a major book, on geometry and religion, until W.B. Yeats brings on his application, also featuring a new moon in Sagittarius, and 4 tarot items attached to the wheel. And by the way, there's something, notice those 4 words that are on that wheel. Sapientia? Yes. Remember, it all starts with Sapientia. And it should be remembered that Yeats's mistress was known as Sapientia Deodate. She is the origin of the lunar wheel. Florence Farr collected everything she could ever find on Egyptology, and she was very actively putting them in private rights, which do not now survive. Only one, I found 70 pages of Florence's papers in the August of 1971, and no second group has so far emerged. They were literally haphazard. They were in a trunk that formerly belonged to Arthur Edward Waite. I got them from Geoffrey Watkins at the basement of his bookshop. Geoffrey remembered as a young man how Florence had come in with that trunk and left it, saying a friend would call in 1912 before she went to Ceylon. Many years later, we're now up into the 1940s, Geoffrey is going through a room at the Society of Sacra Rosa Cruciana in Anglica, opposite Mason's Hall in London, and what does he spy but the trunk, which he recognizes immediately as the trunk he had carried in for Florence 30-some years before. He bought it for 15 pounds or so from the Masons and took it back down, after the Rosicrucians, and took it back down to his shop, where he opened it shortly before I arrived on my way to Ireland. And I'm literally going down the basement steps, and I whirled like this. What's that? I'll swear it looks like Florence Farr's writing, and there were indeed 70 pages of Florence's stuff. Unfortunately, there was a trunk open about so high, and when Geoffrey opened that trunk, he saw it go into little pieces crumbling. Arthur Edward Waite kept everything in his moldy basement. I think Waite probably loved keeping the moldy crypt under his house, and he had Florence's things down there, and when they were reopened to the air, they went into nothing. You could see these little bits of fragments, absolutely frustrating. I've seen these papers 3 times over the last 20 years. Every time I see them, they're diminishing further and further, and I'm afraid every so often somebody gets into them and decides, well, the public shouldn't have this, or oh, I would like to take that home for myself. Still, there was enough. It at least gave a basis for proceeding. Geoffrey thought that it must have been Waite who called for the trunk. I was misled by this information for many years indeed. I mean, after all, Florence had left the trunk at Geoffrey's father, John Watkins, instead of friend recall. Geoffrey found the trunk over at the Sacra Society. Apparently it was willed to them by Arthur Edward Waite, and they had never bothered to open it or check it out. And mustn't Waite have been the friend who called for Florence Farr's papers? Not likely, in view of what I'm about to tell you this afternoon. Waite unquestionably stole the material under false pretenses and was using it for blackmail in 1920 in a shocking interchange with J.B. Brodie Innes, the last head of the Golden Dawn. But hereby hangs a tale. Since 1893, Florence and W.B. Yeats had been working on their own set of tarot readings. They used books and star maps, which have never been mentioned publicly in this respect. I'll give you the names now, but believe me, I spent 20 years trying to puzzle these things out, and I'm not anywhere near the 30 years and not near the end of the game. But Yeats's whole theory of history was not born in 1917, 1925. He and Florence were playing with a series of star maps, which came up from Australia, of all places, with a man named Melville, Henry Melville. His book, Veritas, was published posthumously in 1873. It's got everything in it from Lita's egg to the rise of the battle of the gods sets in Osiris. Melville saw all human history as being transformed on star maps, but he never made plain what his theory was. In addition to the published book posthumously, there were 4 vellum volumes, which Yeats and Florence had certainly seen, one on history, the history of the world projected on the globe. This manuscript is not currently available. I have, however, seen another one of the 4 Melville manuscripts, and there's no question that W.B. Yeats and Florence Farr were projecting it. They had a globe. And one is hardly getting started around here, but that's the one measures a so-called beginning anyway. But Florence and William had a 2-dimensional chessboard. I'll show you the way they set it up with tarot cards. This is the arrangement. It's very simple. It's a map of 3 worlds. Florence, this is the way they would have used it. You know in your Kabbalah, there's 4 worlds. There's Absolute, which is not really a world at all. It's the ultimate you can go in. And there's Bria, which is the world of creation. And there's Yetzirah, which is the world of formation. And there's Azia, which is the world we live in. Now, look over here on this side. Notice that they've got the infinity symbol at the top. Here it is. You can't see it there, but the infinity symbol is on the second card as well. You put 2 infinity symbols at the opening of Bria and of Yetzirah. And there should be a 3rd infinity symbol down there on the bottom. But gee, that would get us into some trouble. You would be putting it on the devil, or Pan, or Set. And we don't see any infinity symbol, otherwise known as the Vesica Pisces or the fish's liver. However, one card has been left out, the Fool. Yeats, by the way, in his play says his hermit is teaching the doctrine of the 3 worlds, and that his pupils, before they could understand anything else, must understand the doctrine of 3 worlds. But his doctrine is being thrown off in his play, The Hourglass, because there's this fool who keeps coming in there and asking the most stupid questions imaginable. At any rate, the question is, of the 3 worlds, it's said to be solved if you know where you can place the fool. And I will give you Florence and William's solution, which is not that you will find on any... Oh, here's a better copy. Here's a better copy. I will now give you where you put the fool. And this works perfectly beautifully on this arrangement, which was not part of the Golden Dawn. It was never in Golden Dawn, and this is the first time I'm showing it to you publicly. I gave a talk on this back in '87 for the 100th anniversary of the Golden Dawn. The fool goes exactly in the middle, making a cross at the exact center. Why is he placed in the middle? Because obviously you cannot portray the 4th world. Therefore, he's represented by the 0. And you get back into it not from the top, but from the center. This is basically, Florence had an Egyptian tarot. She had an Egyptian organ.